Mr. James loved books more than anything else in life, especially old books. They were a special love for him. He was keen every year to buy a new set of books. His library grew noticeably. Mr. James used to spend a lot of money to buy books, and he was always fascinated by libraries and could not resist entering them and enjoying the various books on display. He was always tracking the houses and properties that were sold at auctions, and in those auctions he was not occupied with pieces of furniture, decoration, clothes, or accessories. Rather, he was always searching for libraries and complete collections of books. This was a hobby that he inherited from his father, who, since James was a young child, was keen to cultivate within him a love of books and reading. His mother also encouraged him in this matter and stressed to him that the reason for her love for his father and the secret of her agreeing to marry him was that he owned a large library. The whole small family used to gather together to read, and it was normal for James's father and mother to sit down to discuss what they were reading about. Those sessions always made James feel happy and reassured. But unfortunately, life can take everything from an individual in 1 second without warning. One day, James was visiting relatives alone. His father and mother were both at home together, and his mother was pregnant at this time with his brother or sister. But unfortunately, she fell asleep while she was sleeping in the library while reading and did not notice the candles that melted to burn some of the book leaves on the table. The fire spread to pieces of furniture and curtains, and the house turned into a flame of fire that was not extinguished until after his mother died. No one knows whether James's mother died from a burn or whether she suffocated on the smoke and died before it was burned. But what is certain is that everything in the house turned to ashes on this day. When James's father returned home, he found it in this state. He was overcome by a state of sadness and depression that lasted for days. Unfortunately, he could not get rid of it. Rather, he was escaping it by drinking alcohol, which over time turned into an addiction. James's father would suffer from bouts of anger. In his bouts of despair, he used to destroy anything around him. One time, he woke up to find that he had destroyed a lot of the furniture in the house and found that James was hiding in the corner, crying in fear. At that time, he decided to send James to his sister's house to live with her. Only a few months after James moved to live with his aunt, it got worse. James's father's condition worsened, and he began not to let go of the glass of wine from his hand. Unfortunately, in one of his bouts of despair, he began to drink more severely, so he fell dead, and the doctor said that the cause of death was excessive drinking and sadness. Since that day, James has not returned to his father's house. His aunt decided to sell the house in order to provide James with all his needs. She was affectionate and compassionate with him. She knew that he lost his mother, father, and all his family on the day the house burned, so she decided to provide him with everything he needed to live a life. He is happy and does not feel like he is missing anything. James was an obedient child, an intelligent teenager, a strong young man, and a handsome man. His aunt never felt that he was an additional burden or responsibility on her. The only thing that bothered her was his love of books and his great passion for buying more books at short intervals, and that is why she always scolds him for buying books. James was very attached to his aunt. In addition to her being affectionate and compassionate towards him, he always felt that had she not been in his life would have been completely destroyed after the death of his mother, especially since his father was unable to care for him or even himself, and that is why he felt that his aunt during that period was a lifesaver for him. The only problem that always occurred between him and his aunt was his excessive purchase of books. Even after little James grew up and became a man, he continued to live in his aunt's house and was unable to leave her. He knew that in exchange for raising him, his aunt refused to marry and was never able to having children or starting a family. So Mrs. Mary, Mr. James's aunt, was not happy with what he was doing. She felt that he had turned the house into a large old library. She did not hate books, but she could not forget that one day books were the cause of the complete destruction of her brother's family's life, and that is why she felt afraid of those books. Lady Mary also believed in myths and was keen to go to parties where gypsies were present because they had a known ability to tell fortunes and predict the future. Lady Mary spent many years of her life taking care of James and never once felt any regret that she had devoted her whole life to him. She shared many of his interests, and even the books that she was often afraid of. She would read them with him when she felt that there was something that interested her or caught her attention. Mrs. Mary warned Mr. James a lot about buying books in such quantities, as she saw that he was wasting his father's and his family's money on books which were now occupying a large space in the house. Here, Mrs. Mary sat down to tell James what she was thinking, and they both agreed on a solution that satisfies both parties. And the solution is constructing a new part belonging to the house as an expansion, as Lady Mary decided to leave the old rooms to James as they were, to turn them into a large library as he had always dreamed, and to add this annex to be dedicated to her, to turn it into a luxurious sitting room with new furniture, an area far from James's books, where she could meet her friends or having the tea parties that I was deprived of because of the books that piled up everywhere thanks to James. James knew that building a new extension to the house would require a lot of time and effort, but he agreed because he knew that this solution would be ideal for him so that he would not get rid of his books, which he had spent many years of his life collecting. He also felt excited that his aunt would finally allow him to establish a library. It was large in her home after years of rejection. That library had a great importance for James. Other than that, he would put his books in it. That library would help him remember his father and mother and their entertaining and interesting sessions in which they used to exchange opinions about the books they read. Construction work had already begun, and James was fully responsible for monitoring the workers and making sure that everything was going well, especially since his aunt, Mrs. Mary, wanted a specific design that she had previously drawn with James, and so he had to be present at all times, monitoring the progress of work in the building. Of course, James was not able to go on his favorite trips to buy books. He felt strange, but he would not leave work at home to go buy books. He was afraid that his aunt would kill him if he did this. Truth be told, Mrs. Mary at that time felt relieved that she had finally managed to control her nephew and prevent him from buying books, even for a limited time. The work continued for a period that was not long, and soon everything was over. And then Mrs. Mary began to agree with her nephew on the pieces of furniture that she would need in the new part of the house. He also needed more pieces to furnish his dream library, so they both sat together to agree on what they needed. Mr. James wrote down all the pieces that his aunt told him about, and all the decorative pieces that she wanted, as well as the curtains that Aunt Mary was keen to describe and emphasize. James won't forget it. Mr. James traveled to London and began searching among the stores in London until he chose all the pieces that the house needed. All that remained for Mr. James was to choose the curtains. While Mr. James was heading to the store that sold the curtains, he noticed one of the largest and oldest bookshops in London. He said to himself, "Why not go in and take a quick look, and then go to the curtain shop and from there to the train station to return to Warwickshire?" Mr. James entered the library, in which he felt enchanted. He spent his entire time looking at the books on all the shelves, and then he noticed a special section for old books. As soon as he entered this section, Mr. James forgot everything related to time and curtains, and spent the entire time among the books. Then he glimpsed a small group of books, and when he approached it, he found a small book called Mr. Pointer's Diary. The book was dated 1710. Mr. James was unable to leave the book. He picked it up and went to buy it. Here, Mr. James looked at his watch after paying for the book and found that there was no time left for the train to return to Warwickshire. The train was only 30 minutes away, so he had to hurry to the station. Mr. James could not afford to buy the curtains, and he knew that this would upset his aunt, who would not hesitate to scold him for not buying everything she asked of him. Mr. James finally arrived home, and his aunt asked him carefully about his trip to London, and she wanted to know all the details about the new furniture. Then James sat down and described to her all the pieces of furniture he had chosen in detail, and she felt happy. But suddenly, she remembered the curtains, so she asked James, "What about curtains, James? Have you been to the curtain shop?" Mr. James replied, feeling hesitant, "My dear, I could not reach the store in time. I was already on my way to the curtain store when I happened to see Robin's store." Lady Mary interrupted him, saying, "No, I hope it is Robin's library. Don't tell me you bought terrible old books again, James." James tried to look regretful and said to her, "Well, it's only one book, and it's a very interesting story. The diary of someone who lived near here." James pointed at the new book on the table. Mrs. Mary approached the book and began to look at its pages. Noticed that James said that the book attracted her attention, so he felt happy and was sure that his aunt would forgive him. Lady Mary looked at the book and said to James, "Well, James, you will not be able to go down to London again until next Thursday. We can decide what the curtains will look like until then." Lady Mary left the book and went to her room to sleep. Then James sat to read in his new book for some time, but he did not pay attention to the time until the early hours of the morning. The stories written in the book were very exciting. Most of them deal with daily life, but it was interesting. The next morning, it was a Sunday, so James and his aunt went to church. After they returned, they both sat in the living room. Lady Mary picked up the book from the table and said to Mr. James, "Is this the old book that made you forget my curtains?" "Well, it doesn't look good." "Mr. Pointer's diary." She said that sentence sarcastically, but she opened the book, looking at its pages, and suddenly signs of interest began to appear on her face. James felt curious because of his aunt's appearance, so he went to her to see what she was reading. Then Lady Mary pointed to something in the book and said, "Isn't it pretty?" James looked at the part that Mrs. Mary was pointing at and found that it was a small piece of paper stuck in the book. It was a beautiful drawing. It was made up of curved lines with a distinctive shape, which is why it caught the eye of Mrs. Mary. James then suggested to his aunt that he copy that drawing and transform it to the curtains if she liked them. James was trying to please his aunt and compensate her for the curtains so that she would forgive him and not mention the previous day again. Indeed, Mrs. Mary agreed to James's proposal, and the next day, James took the piece of paper from the diary book and went to one of the companies that works in the field of printing in order to copy these drawings and turn them into curtains. A month later from that day, the company summoned James to see the drawings, and he was very happy with the result. James asked the company director, "Was it a difficult task?" The company director replied and said, "It was not a difficult task, sir, but to tell you the truth, the artist doing the work was very unhappy with it." James asked curiously, "Why?" The company manager replied, "He was saying there was something in the drawing." James did not care about what the company director said and continued choosing the colors of the curtains and then returned to his home. Although James was always thinking about details, this time he did not think much about it. As usual, he sat in the chair next to his bed to read before going to sleep. After a few weeks, the curtains were ready, and one of the company's employees actually came to install them in the new part of the house, as well as a number of other rooms in the house, and James's room was one of those rooms. The curtains were distinctive and beautiful, and James felt that he could not stop looking at them, and on the same night, he felt that the curtains were moving, even though the air was slow and the atmosphere was relatively hot. But the curtains were not moving like this. The curtains were moving as if there was something behind them, as if there was someone standing behind the curtains watching him. And here James felt he probably stayed up too late and assured himself that there was no one in the room with him, and what he is thinking is just stupidity. And certainly that movement is only in his imagination as a result of the curved lines on the curtains, which look like long, curly black hair. James slept that night and tried not to think about it. In the morning, James forgot everything, especially when his friend came to have dinner with him and to stay with him that night. James and his friend sat for a while, exchanging conversations until late at night. Then James took his friend to the guest room to sleep, and he went to his room to read a little, and then he slept. While sitting in his chair next to the bed, James fell asleep for a few minutes in his place, and when he woke up, he felt that there was something with him in the room. As he was moving, he felt his hand touch something covered with hair, and immediately he thought it was his dog, which it used to follow him everywhere. But James asked himself how the dog could enter the room. He left it in the basement and closed the door on himself and did not open it again. Then he looked at the dog and did not find it. Rather, he found a strange, terrifying creature. It seemed human. This being suddenly jumped in front of James's face. And then James realized that this being had no eyes, no nose, or a mouth. It was just hair. So James screamed and headed towards the door of his room to get out, because he was so frightened that he was unable to open the door. Meanwhile, he felt this being approaching him and touching his back, and then he tore off James's shirt. Fortunately, at that moment, James was able to open the door and went out towards the guest room where he had his friend. James was terrified and breathing hard. His friend tried to calm him down so he would know what happened, but James couldn't even explain what he saw and what happened to him. The next morning, Mr. James's friend left, and Mr. James also decided to leave the house and go to the sea for several days in order to try to forget that horrific experience he had gone through. Mr. James took the book, Mr. Pointer's Diary, with him because he wanted to read it again carefully. This was in order to discover anything about the drawings he found in the book and turn them into curtains. Indeed, upon his arrival, James began to examine the book, and then he reached the part from which he took the drawings and found that there were several other papers pinned in the same place that James did not pay attention to at the time. He pulled it carefully, and examined the papers and found a story behind them that he had not noticed the first time. The story was written in handwriting and was apparently the handwriting of Mr. Pointer himself. He wrote down saying, "Old Mr. Casbury of Accrington told me one day about young Sir Everard Charlotte, who was a student at university. He committed a lot of foolishness and violations, and the university condoned his behavior because he was from one of the most important English families, and no matter what mistakes he committed, no one held him accountable. Sir Everard used to drink alcohol in large quantities, wear colorful clothes that were not appropriate for the university, and used to leave his hair very long. His hair was curly and black, and his appearance was striking to everyone, and this made his father very unhappy with what he was doing. And one day, without any warning, Sir Everard was found dead in his room, and all his hair had been pulled out. The police were unable to know who killed him, and the doctors could not explain how he died or why his hair was removed. The next day, Mr. Everard's body completely disappeared from the room, leaving only a pile of his long, black, curly hair on the floor of the room. His father felt sad and decided to keep some of his hair. The case was strange and complicated, which is why the police drew the hair that remained of Sir Everard as one of the evidence in the case. I actually obtained those strange drawings and pinned them above the story. Mr. James felt very afraid after he read that story and decided to return. But before he returned to his home, he contacted the company that made the curtains and asked them to remove all the curtains and burn them. Only here he remembered what the painter said about the curtains and understood why he said that there was something in those drawings. Mr. James returned to his aunt's house, and indeed he did not find the curtains, so he felt comfortable. But at the same time he felt worried because he did not find his aunt, who used to greet him every time he came from one of his trips. Mr. James went up to his aunt's room to find her sitting on the bed, looking exhausted, tired, and looking distracted, as if she was thinking about something. James sat next to his aunt, who hugged him as if she had not seen him for years. James thought that something was wrong with her. He began to ask her about what had happened to her, and she tried to explain to him that she no longer felt comfortable at home and that something strange was happening to her. James suspected that the effect of the curtains was still there, so he asked her to tell him what she felt or what she saw. Then his aunt began to talk about her feeling that there was someone watching her. She felt that he was standing behind the new curtains, and when the workers came to take the curtains once again, she felt comfortable and imagined that the matter ended there. Indeed, she slept well for the first time since installing the curtains, but since then she has been finding strange things in the house. James asked her, "What do you find in the house?" His aunt answered hesitantly, "I find hair, a lot of hair, black hair, long, curly." James felt a coldness sweeping over his body and did not know how to react. Should he tell his aunt what he knew or hide the matter from her? Mr. James decided to hide everything he knew from his aunt so he wouldn't increase her fears. But as the days passed, Mr. James also noticed a lot of hair everywhere, on the floor, on the bed, on the bookshelves. And here he decided to talk to her about everything. He asked his aunt to sit down and he began to tell her everything he knew. James thought that his aunt would be angry and that she would accuse him of being the reason for what happened to them. But she looked in astonishment and asked him, "How will we act now?" Mr. James did not know what to say to her, but she did not give him the opportunity. She asked him to come with her the next day to one of the distant houses. The house was small and seemed unfamiliar to James. He tried to ask his aunt, but she told him to wait, and he would understand everything. His aunt asked him to wait outside, then entered the house, and then came out with a strange-looking woman. This woman moved with James and his aunt to their house, and there she sat on the floor and took out some candles and papers from her bag, and began saying some words in a strange language. James was astonished, and his aunt was holding the Bible and hugging it to her chest. After a short time, this strange woman got up from her place, smiling and telling them, "Well, the house has returned to you again. It was an angry spirit who lost her way, and now it returned to her place." Then she looked at James as if she had known him for a long time and said, "Young sir will never come back again."